The distressed signal. The distant stars blurred into streaks of white as Hank Fincher's small courier ship hurtled through the infinite expanse of hyperspace. The soft hum of the ship's engine was a lullaby that had long become a part of his daily life. Hank was a courier, an independent contractor who made his living by transporting goods across vast stretches of space. His job was simple enough: pick up the cargo, deliver it to the destination, and move on to the next. But the isolation that came with it, the endless expanse of space stretching out before him, often felt like a heavy cloak. His current haul was no different. He was transporting a standard shipment from the real system to Proxima Station, a station bustling with trade and travelers from countless star systems. The journey had been long, and Hank was looking forward to a well-deserved break when he reached the station. He had been in space for too long, and the thought of a warm meal and a soft bed waiting for him felt like the light at the end of a long tunnel. As the ship drifted through the void, Hank reclined in the pilot's seat, trying to stifle a yawn. His eyes fluttered shut for a brief moment, but before he could fully relax, the sharp beep of the alarm shattered the silence. It was a distress signal, its pitch high and insistent. Hank's hand shot out to silence it instinctively, but the sound didn't stop. It was coming from a nearby location, just outside his current trajectory. Hank's eyes snapped open. The distress beacon was faint, but it was unmistakable. His gaze shifted to the readouts on the console, scanning the coordinates that appeared on the screen. A vessel in distress. His gut told him it wasn't just a malfunction or a routine call. There was something off about it. He ran a quick mental checklist. His cargo was overdue, and the clock was ticking. He had no obligation to respond to the signal. As an independent contractor, Hank was only responsible for one thing: getting his cargo to its destination. He could just ignore the distress signal, keep his course, and be done with it. But for some reason, something inside him pushed him to make a decision he didn't fully understand. Hank hesitated for a long moment. He stared at the coordinates again, his finger hovering over the controls. It wasn't his job to play the hero, but he wasn't just a mindless driver of cargo. He'd been in space long enough to know that sometimes you didn't walk away from a call for help. Not all situations were as straightforward as they seemed. Sighing, Hank punched in the new coordinates. "All right, let's see what we've got here," he muttered under his breath. With a soft hum, the ship's navigation system shifted course, locking onto the beacon's location. Seconds later, the view out of the cockpit window shifted as the stars blinked into regular alignment. Hank knew they were about to drop out of hyperspace, and the familiar sensation of deceleration made his body stiffen. His hand tightened on the control stick, instinctively preparing himself for whatever he might find. As the ship slowed and the starfield outside the window expanded into a more familiar scene, Hank's breath caught. The wreckage before him was massive, larger than anything he had ever encountered. Floating in the cold void of space was an alien ship, a sleek, silver vessel, torn and scarred, as though it had been through hell. There were deep gashes along its hull, and the once shimmering surface now appeared dull, with patches of burnt, blackened metal. Pieces of the ship drifted aimlessly through space, evidence of an explosion or an intense battle. Hank's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the sight. He'd seen his share of wrecks, but this one was different. The ship's design wasn't anything he recognized. Its smooth curves and intricate shapes were far beyond the standard designs used by the more familiar spacefaring species. This was not the work of the the Terrans, or any of the other groups he regularly encountered. This was something new, something unfamiliar. And the thought that whoever was responsible for this had left it to drift through space sent a shiver down Hank's spine. But it was the lack of life signs that caused Hank's gut to twist. No heat signatures, no biological readings. The ship was completely dead. "Damn," Hank muttered, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He brought the ship closer, maneuvering with caution as he examined the remains. There was no immediate threat, no sign of any debris that might have been left by a recent attack. Everything appeared eerily still. It was as if whatever had happened to this ship had happened long ago, and its crew had long since perished. But then, something caught his eye. A faint, flickering energy signature. At first, it was weak, barely a blip on his console's readout. But Hank's curiosity piqued, and against his better judgment, he decided to investigate further. His fingers hovered over the controls, setting the ship on a new course toward the flickering signal. "Let's see what you're hiding," Hank murmured as he engaged the maneuvering thrusters, slowly guiding his ship toward the area from which the faint signal was emanating. The wreckage was a maze of twisted metal, scattered debris, and broken technology. Hank's ship moved slowly as he expertly navigated the debris field, carefully avoiding any large chunks of wreckage. The ship's damaged hull creaked as he floated deeper into the remains of the alien craft. Inside the derelict ship, the emergency lights flickered in a dull crimson glow, casting eerie shadows across the destruction. The corridors were tight, narrow, and littered with shattered screens, wires, and burnt-out equipment. Hank moved carefully, making his way through the wreckage. His pulse quickened as the energy signature grew stronger, guiding him deeper into the ship. His hand reached for his suit's oxygen supply, knowing the air inside the wreckage might be thin. The slight hiss of his suit's seals locking into place filled the otherwise silent space around him. He made his way cautiously toward the source of the signal. As he turned a corner, his breath caught in his throat. There, nestled among the wreckage, was something that stopped him dead in his tracks. The large, pearlescent pod, its surface cracked in several places, with a faint energy pulse flickering from within. It looked like a containment chamber, something used to hold living creatures in stasis. Hank's mind raced as he approached. Whatever was inside, it was alive, though the energy signature was fading. He stepped closer, cautiously pulling open the damaged hatch. A rush of vapor poured out, momentarily obscuring his vision. When the mist cleared, Hank found himself staring at three small, motionless creatures nestled inside the pod. They were unlike anything he had ever seen. About the size of human toddlers, their smooth blue skin was marred by dark stripes, and their bodies were muscular, with powerful hind legs that looked capable of impressive jumps. Their small forelimbs were shorter than their legs, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. But it was their faces that caught Hank's attention, their large, almond-shaped eyes, now dull and lifeless, and their small, delicate mouths, almost as if they were in a state of suspended animation. Hank's heart sank. The creatures appeared to be in some kind of stasis, their lives hanging by the thinnest thread. Without hesitation, he carefully began to assess the pod, checking for any signs of malfunction or malfunctioning systems. Time was running out for these creatures. He had no idea who they were or where they had come from. But one thing was certain: they needed help. Hank closed his eyes for a brief moment, a deep sigh escaping him. He was a courier, not a savior. But he couldn't just leave them. Something inside him stirred, a feeling of responsibility that he couldn't ignore. "I guess you're coming with me," he muttered to the lifeless creatures. The decision. Hank Fincher stood frozen, staring at the creatures inside the stasis pod, his mind racing. The small, lifeless forms of the alien beings lay still, their bodies strangely beautiful and haunting at the same time. He had never seen anything like them. Their blue skin shimmered faintly in the dim crimson glow of the wrecked ship, and the way their bodies were shaped made it clear they were unlike any known species in the galaxy. They were far too small to be dangerous, but their design, their biological makeup, it was all completely foreign to him. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out and gently touched the edge of the pod. The faint energy pulse flickered weakly, confirming that the life support system was barely functioning. The pod wasn't broken, but it wasn't stable either. It was a race against time. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the knowledge that in just a few more hours, it could be too late for the creatures inside. But how could he make such a decision? "Should I just leave you here?" Hank muttered, though he already knew the answer. His eyes flicked back toward the wrecked ship around him. The distress signal had led him here, but this was no ordinary ship. The technology, the design, it all seemed so advanced, so alien. Who were these beings? Why were they abandoned in the depths of space, left to die alone on a wrecked vessel? Hank's mind wandered back to the brief moment before, when he had entered the ship. The silence, the emptiness, everything about it felt wrong. The crew, if there ever was one, was long gone. Whoever had left this wreckage had done so intentionally. The ship wasn't destroyed by accident. It was clear that this was no ordinary cargo ship or military vessel. It was something else entirely, something meant to be hidden. Damn it! Hank cursed under his breath, his thoughts spiraling. But he couldn't leave them. The creatures didn't deserve to die like this, abandoned and forgotten. He wasn't a hero. He was just a courier, a man who had learned to stick to his job and keep things simple. But out here, in the unknown, things were never simple. Something about these creatures called to him, a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. They needed help. He let out a long breath and slowly pulled off his gloves, trying to stay calm. The oxygen inside the wrecked ship was thin, but it wasn't the real danger. The real threat was the pod's failing systems. If the life support went offline, if the stasis chamber malfunctioned beyond repair, there was no coming back for them. With quick, deliberate movements, Hank began assessing the pod systems. He was no expert in alien technology, but he had dealt with enough broken equipment to know the basics of troubleshooting. His fingers danced over the controls, checking the energy readings, assessing the temperature, and trying to stabilize the pod's life support. The creatures inside were small, but they had enough biological complexity that even the smallest error in the pod systems could spell disaster. His mind raced. He had never been trained for this, never signed up for anything that wasn't routine. But deep down, Hank knew he couldn't just leave these creatures to die. They had been abandoned, left to drift in space for reasons he couldn't understand. And now, they were his responsibility. I can't fix this ship. Hell, I'm not even sure I can fix the pod, Hank said, mostly to himself. But then something strange happened. As his hand brushed against the pod's surface, a small pulse of light flickered from inside. The creatures stirred. For a brief moment, one of them twitched, its small body shifting in response to the pulse. Hank's heart skipped a beat. They weren't dead. They were alive, just barely. The pulse was faint, but it was enough to reignite Hank's determination. There was hope. They weren't completely gone. They could still be saved. He didn't waste another second. Hank adjusted the controls on the pod, trying to stabilize the environment within the chamber. He carefully calibrated the energy flow, adjusting the power to ensure that the life support system would hold for as long as possible. He wasn't sure how long he had, but he had to work fast. He had to get the creatures out of here and back to his ship. There was no time to waste. His fingers flew across the console, manipulating the settings. He felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He could leave this wreck and complete his job. No one would fault him for it. His cargo was already overdue, and his mission was clear. But something about this felt different. This wasn't just about completing a job anymore. This was about something bigger. The creatures in front of him, fragile and vulnerable, deserved a chance. They didn't deserve to die in the cold void of space. Not like this. With a soft hiss, the pod's hatch opened slightly, releasing a burst of vapor. Hank quickly stepped back, holding his breath as the chamber hissed and whined. As the mist dissipated, he found himself staring at the creatures once more. They hadn't moved, but there was no denying the life within them. They were breathing, albeit faintly. But that was all he needed. They had a chance. "All right, little guys," Hank muttered, trying to shake the unease that lingered in his gut. "Let's get you out of here." He carefully lifted the smallest of the creatures from the pod, feeling its fragile form in his arms. It was surprisingly light, but its smooth skin was warm to the touch. As he cradled it gently, Hank glanced at the other two creatures. They were bigger than the first, but just as fragile-looking. He couldn't leave them behind. His mind raced as he juggled the decision. The ship he had called home for the past few years was small, and his cargo hold was already full. There was barely enough room for himself, let alone 3 alien creatures. But that was a problem he'd have to solve. They needed a place to be cared for, and Hank knew there wasn't any help coming. He was their only hope. Hank moved quickly but carefully, gently lifting each creature from the pod and placing them onto a makeshift bed he had fashioned from the emergency blankets stored on board his ship. The creatures were small, but they were resilient. He could feel it in the way they clung to him. When all 3 creatures were safely aboard, Hank turned his gaze back to the wrecked ship, now more of a ruin than anything else. He couldn't leave them there. They weren't just abandoned. They were survivors, and they deserved a chance. Turning back to the creatures, Hank gave a soft sigh, his resolve solidifying. He'd seen his fair share of strange, dangerous things out in the stars. But this felt different. He wasn't just delivering cargo anymore. He was saving lives. "I'll get you home," he promised quietly, his voice soft as he adjusted the controls of his ship. With a deep breath, Hank Fincher set the course for Proxima Station, knowing his path had irrevocably changed. He wasn't just a courier anymore, he was a protector. And whatever the future held, he was ready for it. The weight of responsibility. Hank Fincher settled into the pilot's seat of his ship, the controls familiar beneath his fingertips, but his thoughts were far from routine. The creatures, those strange, beautiful beings, were now resting in the small cargo hold behind him. Their forms were peaceful now, their once unmoving bodies showing signs of life as the faint rhythmic rise and fall of their chests indicated slow but steady breathing. Despite his best attempts to remain detached, Hank couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The stars outside the cockpit window stretched out into the vast unknown, each one a distant point of light, a reminder that space was endless, unforgiving. It felt as though his entire universe had just been shifted, as though the discovery of these creatures was the key to something far larger than a simple cargo run. They weren't just any creatures. Whoever had left them behind had done so deliberately, with intent. The ship they had come from was unlike anything Hank had ever seen, a work of alien engineering so advanced that it left him with more questions than answers. The wreckage he had found had been unnervingly clean for something that had been abandoned. There were no signs of violent struggle, no wreckage left by a battle. It felt as though someone had simply decided to sever all ties to the ship and its occupants. The pod itself, where the creatures had been kept, seemed to be the only thing that had survived. Everything about it screamed that it was meant for something, or someone, important. As the ship glided silently through space, Hank's thoughts shifted to the creatures again. He'd never seen anything like them. Their blue skin, marked by darker, almost ink-like stripes, gave them an air of exotic beauty. Their small but muscular bodies, combined with the powerful hind legs, made Hank think they were built for something beyond just survival, something graceful, yet strong. The large eyes, so dark, yet somehow expressive, lingered in his mind. They were unlike any species he had encountered. They seemed familiar, but at the same time utterly foreign. They were intelligent, Hank was certain of that. He glanced at the small video screen that displayed their vital signs. It was a mix of biomonitor readings and a series of alien symbols he couldn't decipher. The vital signs were weak but stable. The creatures were alive, but just barely. They needed sustenance. They needed care. And Hank was no expert in alien biology. He had no idea what they ate, how they survived, or what kind of environment they needed. He had no way of knowing what to do for them. The ship's systems beeped softly, a reminder that he needed to make some decisions. He wasn't just going to deliver them to Proxima Station. He couldn't. No, he needed to get them to safety, to a place where they could be examined, where they could be treated. But what if they were from a species that was dangerous? What if they weren't the innocent beings he thought they were? His mind raced with the possibilities. The wreckage had looked abandoned, intentionally abandoned. But Hank's gut told him that wasn't the full story. There was more going on than he could comprehend. The galaxy was full of strange stories and politics, none of which he wanted to get caught in. He was just a courier, a simple man doing a job. But now, it seemed like fate had thrown him a curveball he wasn't ready for. He was no longer just carrying cargo. He was carrying lives, alien lives. As Hank pushed the ship's engines forward, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. Proxima Station was too close for comfort. It was a bustling hub, filled with travelers from all over the galaxy. Would anyone even believe him if he showed up with 3 unknown alien creatures? Would they help him, or would they seize them for themselves, eager to profit from the discovery of a new species? The creatures stirred in their makeshift beds in the cargo hold. Hank turned his gaze to the rearview display in the cockpit. His heart softened at the sight of them, their small forms shifting ever so slightly. The light from the ship's systems cast a soft glow over their blue skin. One of them seemed to be twitching in its sleep, as though reacting to the sound of the ship's hum. Hank smiled slightly. Maybe they were getting better, after all. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He needed to keep them safe, until he could figure out what to do next. The last thing he wanted was to involve the wrong people. Proxima Station was full of traders, smugglers, and bounty hunters. If word got out that he was carrying alien life forms, there was no telling what would happen. But he didn't have any choice. These creatures needed help, and Hank had never been one to back down from a challenge, no matter how daunting it seemed. Suddenly, the ship shuddered. Hank's heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively gripped the controls as the craft jolted. His eyes snapped to the control panel. The ship's engines had flickered, a burst of warning lights flashing across the console. "What the hell?" Hank muttered under his breath. The ship was an older model, but it had been reliable until now. Something was wrong. He ran a quick diagnostic and saw that there was a fluctuation in the power system. It wasn't critical yet, but it was enough to send a spike of anxiety through his chest. The last thing he needed was to get stuck in deep space with damaged systems, especially with 3 fragile creatures depending on him. "Come on, just hold together," Hank said, gritting his teeth as he began manually adjusting the ship's power. The problem was minor, likely just a faulty capacitor or some other minor malfunction. He worked quickly, rerouting power to keep the engines running. But the incident only served to remind him that the universe was unpredictable, and it wasn't always kind. As the ship steadied, Hank leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face in frustration. He wasn't going to make it easy on him, was it? A simple job had turned into something far more complicated, and now he was stuck carrying 3 vulnerable alien creatures through the most dangerous space lanes in the galaxy. His thoughts shifted to the future. What would happen when he got to Proxima Station? What would the creatures need to survive? The stars stretched before him in a blur of light as he pushed the ship forward, speeding toward his uncertain future. He had no idea what lay ahead, no idea who was looking for these creatures, or whether anyone would even care if he brought them to safety. But one thing was certain: Hank wasn't going to let them down. He was carrying more than just cargo now. He was carrying a responsibility, a duty. As the ship continued its journey through space, Hank couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Something bigger than he could understand was unfolding before him, and whether he was ready for it or not, he was now part of something far greater than a simple courier run. He was a protector of these creatures, strange, vulnerable, and alive in a galaxy that often seemed indifferent to life itself. He glanced once more at the creatures in the cargo hold, each of them still breathing, still holding on. Hank's resolve solidified. He wasn't about to let anything happen to them. They might not be his responsibility in the grand scheme of the galaxy, but they were his now, and he wasn't going to let them down. Not now, not ever.